Hey everyone, in this tutorial I'll show you how to paint this mystical forest using gouache. If you prefer to paint with me in real time, I do have the full 1.5 hour long tutorial available on my Patreon page, and I'll have the link down below for that. Let's quickly go through the materials. I'm using Canson mixed media paper that's just taped down with some washi tape, and I'll be using the Himi gouache today, but you can follow along with any gouache that you might have. I've got a water tank in the top right corner and just a towel to soak up some water. You can use tissues or paper towels. As for my brushes, I am going to be using 3 of my own brushes from my brush set that I have designed in collaboration with Craft Ammo, and they will be released later this year. I'll be sharing a lot more information on them and making many more tutorials with them. But just to give you a little bit of information on them now, there are going to be 5 brushes in the set, and they're all made from synthetic hairs, and I've designed everything about them and I truly love using them, so you'll definitely see me use them in many more paintings. If you would like to be notified of when they will be released, I'll leave a link down below where you can sign up to be notified of their release date, which is likely to be in December of this year. So I was just really excited to share this with you guys and to show you a sneak peek of what they look like. In this tutorial, I'm also using a Princeton Neptune brush, which I usually use for stippling, but the brushes that I designed also work perfectly for this, and I'll be showing you guys in the future how you can create lots of textures using my brush set. To get started with this painting, we're just going to start with our flat brush, and before this I've just placed in a few lines just for the ground and the path. So using the flat brush, we're going to paint in the background color. I'm going to start by mixing some ultramarine blue and burnt umber. You can also mix in a little bit of black if you want to make the color a bit darker, and I'm just going to paint the top corners of the painting, and then I'm going to gradually add in a bit more of the cool blue and some white, and I'm just painting this curved shape as we paint in the whole gradation of the sky. You want to make sure that your paint consistency is nice and creamy, as this makes it much easier for you to blend the colors smoothly. And you just want to gradually add in the white. You might want to clean off your brush at one point just to get all that blue paint off, so you can start with some clean white. And if you ever need to blend out anything a bit more smoothly, you can just use a clean brush and just brush over the gouache. Also, don't worry if it doesn't look perfect, because this is the background and will be covered by a lot of details in front, so you probably won't notice if there isn't a perfect gradation. And after that, I'm going to start to mix up some burnt umber and yellow ochre. If you don't have yellow ochre, you can always mix up that color yourself. I'll mix in a little bit of white and a little bit of warm yellow, and I'm just trying to find that muted yellowish brown color along the side of the painting, and you want to just blend that out with the current blue that you've painted in. You might want to mix your brushes using the paint that you just mixed up and mix it into the blue mixture in your palette so that you can find an in-between color, or you can clean off your brush and just brush over those areas to smooth it out like I'm doing here. When I blend the gouache on the paper with a clean brush, I do it with a very light hand, and I make sure that there's a lot of creamy gouache on the paper so that when I brush over it, I'm not lifting off too much color and the paint still looks opaque enough on the paper. Then I'm going to move down into more of the yellow color, and I'm going to start with some warm yellow, a little bit of yellow ochre and some white. And again, I'm just brushing in that dome-like shape, and you can do the same thing as before using a clean brush. Just lightly brush over where the two colors meet so that you can smooth out the transition a little. And then I'm going to start from the really bright white center, so mixing in white with a touch of the cool yellow. I'm going to start working from the light color outward, so that way I can control it a little bit better. I would suggest starting with more white in the mixture, because you do want to preserve this part to be quite light. And then if you want to, you can fix up any areas. I am just making the blue a little bit darker up the top because I don't want it to be too bright peeking out behind the trees. Now that we have the background done, I think we have one of the hardest parts done, and we can now start painting in the trees and the foliage and just layer it to create depth in this painting. So I'm going to switch to my round brush and I'm going to mix up a very light color using some yellow ochre and warm yellow and a bit of burnt umber and lots of white. And you want to keep this very pale because we're starting with the layer that's furthest from us, and so it's going to be lightest in value. And also keep in mind that where the light is coming from, everything around that is going to be a lot lighter as well. So the closer you go towards that light, the lighter you want your paint to be. So I start to paint in the tree trunks and some branches coming off of them. Also keep in mind that as we move upwards into the darker blue background, you want the color of the trees to be a little bit darker, so that way they are not too light against the background. Basically, you want to always make sure the trees you're painting are darker than that area of the background. Now I'm going to switch to my other round brush that I'll use for stippling, and I'll mix up the same color, just mix up a little bit more of it, and to use it as a stipple brush, just pinch the base of the brush after you've wet the bristles a little, and then just tap into your paint vertically, and then the brush hairs should split apart and you can use that to stipple on the leaf textures. If you're having trouble with this, some things that I find help are to use paint that's a bit less watery in consistency, because if the paint's very watery, then the hairs usually want to clump together on the brush instead of splitting apart, which is what we want. So that's one thing to watch out for. To make it a little bit darker, I add in a little bit of burnt umber as I move upwards, as I want that area to be darker than the brighter area near the light. And then as I move towards the light, I'm just going to add in more white. So just continue stippling around that area, and you can also add in a tiny bit of red into the mixture just to warm things up and just vary the colors a little bit so they're not all exactly the same. And once you feel like you've got enough of that in there, then you can move on to the next layer where we're going to paint in the trees again and then the foliage on top. So for that, I'll switch to a pointed round brush and I'll mix up some warm yellow with a little bit of the red, a tiny touch of the ultramarine blue just to dull the color a little bit of cool yellow to lighten the color without using white. And using that mixture, I'm going to start to paint in some trees I can see on the far left and right sides. This is kind of the middle layer, so the layer we painted before was in the far background. Now we're inching towards the front, but we're not quite at the foreground layer, so I still make sure to keep this quite light. And again, as I move up into the dark background, I'm going to need to mix up a darker color, which I'll use blue and burnt umber to mix up that darker color. And also note that the side of the trees that are facing the light is going to be lighter, and the side facing away is going to have some shadows. So to create that depth in the trees, make the sides facing away a little bit darker. So you can do that later if you want, just paint in one flat color for the trees first, paint in the branches and all those things, and then come in with the highlights and the shadows. For the branches that are a bit lower, I'm going to mix in a bit more white and burnt umber into the mixture just to make them look a little bit washed out closer to the light. Then I'll paint in the shadows on the left and right sides using a darker mixture. Once I'm happy with that, I'll switch back to my brush that I use for stippling, and I'm going to mix up some dark blue color, making sure it's darker than the background. And using that, I'm going to stipple in a lot of foliage around the top of the painting. And if I want the color to be a little bit lighter, I'll make it a bit more gray by adding in some white, and then I'll add in a little bit of yellow ochre or the warm yellow and stipple in some foliage along the sides. You'll quickly notice if your foliage color is too dark or too light once it dries. If it's too light against the background, it'll look like it's glowing a little bit, so we want to avoid that. And once you're happy with that layer of foliage, we can then paint in the trees that we see are most close to us, and this is going to be darker in value once again. I'm going to start with a burnt umber mixture with burnt umber and ultramarine blue, and then as I paint the top of the tree, I'm going to make that much more blue with a lot more ultramarine in it. I've painted in a darker tree branch on the top right corner. It's not as wide as it may look because half of it crosses onto my washi tape, so just in case you get a bit confused by that thicker dark stroke. And here I'm just refining some of my trees, making some of them a little bit more wide and just working on that transition from lighter brown color down the bottom into a darker blue. And to smooth out the transition, you can just go in with a clean brush and just brush over it, and that should be enough to make it look quite smooth. And then I'll just paint in some more branches. You don't really have to follow what you see in the reference photo, just paint as many branches as you feel like. The more full it is, the nicer it may look, but it does take a little bit of time. Now the next part is one of my favorite, which is painting in the more redder foliage, and I'm going to mix some of the warm red with the warm yellow for this really nice orangey color. And using the brush that I use for stippling, I'll just stipple that along the sides and also a little bit on top. I'll make some of them a little bit more pink, so have a bit more red in the mixture, and some of them a bit more yellow, so just vary the color a little bit. And then to dull it down and make it a bit darker, you can just mix in a little bit of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. I feel like before doing this step, the painting looks quite dull, but as soon as you put in that pop of color, it makes it look a lot more alive. So I really like this step of the painting. For some even lighter foliage, I'm going to mix in a little bit of cool yellow into the mixture and just stipple in some foliage that's closer to the light. And then going back to my round brush for the branches, I'm going to paint on a final layer of dark blue branches up the top. And if you want to, you can switch to a liner brush here, which is a lot easier to control and you get a lot more precision with it. So I'm using my size 1 liner brush to paint in these really thin branches. Now we can work on painting in the path. I'm first going to block in the center part of the path in a very light color, so mixing up some of the cool yellow into the orange color I already have on my palette. I'm going to block that in the center where the path is, and then along the sides I'll just block in a slightly darker reddish brown color. And while the paint is still wet, I drag a little bit of that into the path in the middle so that the transition between them is not very harsh. And then I'm going to just stipple in the fallen foliage. Now a good trick for covering the base of a tree so that it doesn't look awkward where it meets the ground is to just cover that with some foliage. So that's what I'm going to do. And for the foliage colors, I'm using brownish, reddish, orange colors, just a mixture of all those. For some of the really reds, you want to be very careful with them and only place a little bit of it in the fallen foliage area, otherwise your eyes might get drawn to it too much because it's a really strong pop of color. So I saved that for just the very foreground areas. We are almost finished with this painting. I just fix up a few things here and there, and then we can switch back to a pointed round brush and mix up a dark red color, which we'll use to paint on the leaves up the top. So for these leaves, we won't stipple them on, we'll just dot them in individually because they're a little bit larger. So I've just used a red and yellow mixture for this, and for the darker areas up the top, you can just add in a tiny bit of ultramarine blue, which will make it a little bit darker and kind of lean towards purple a bit more. That's basically it for this painting. I do some final touches afterwards. I just add in a few more branches on the right hand side, but other than that, this painting is complete. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and please leave any questions you have down below. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you recreate the painting, feel free to tag me on Instagram so I can see. Hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.